Hi, I'm Rowena. At Thanksgiving, my stepmother laughed in my face, told me I'd never own a home, right before my stepsister poured hot soup down my back. My father, he just watched. They said I was meant to rent forever. What they didn't know is that I'd been paying them $8,200 a month for 3 years. I smiled, wiped the soup off my chest, and whispered, "Maybe you're right." But the next morning, I made one call, and everything started to unravel. Before we begin, what time are you listening to this, and where from? Drop a comment. I promise, it's only going to get worse from here. I pulled into my father's driveway just as the last bit of daylight slipped behind the line of houses. Plano always looked calm this time of year, but that night the whole street felt too polished, like someone had pressed a reset button to make everything look prettier than it really was. I grabbed the pie I'd baked that morning, smoothed my hair, and told myself to breathe. Dad had asked me to come. That was the only reason I was there. When I stepped inside, the first thing that hit me was how staged everything felt. The dining room had never looked that formal when my mother was alive. Laverne had gone all out. Gold-trimmed centerpieces, folded napkins shaped like little turkeys, candles that smelled expensive. The place looked like a magazine cover instead of a family home. She appeared from the kitchen, wearing an apron she definitely didn't cook in, her smile tight and polite. "Well, look who finally made it," she said. "Busy week again?" Her tone had that sweetness people use before they twist the knife. I nodded and thanked her for having me. She didn't move aside to hug me, didn't touch my arm, didn't even look me in the eye for more than a second. She just stepped back and waved toward the dining room like I was one of the neighbors dropping off mail. I walked in and scanned the table. Every seat had a little card with a name written in looping script. Every seat except one. Mine. Laverne must have noticed me standing there because she called out behind me, "Just squeeze in somewhere. We didn't know if you were coming on time." I heard a tiny laugh to my right. Marla was leaning back in her chair, swirling her wine, giving me the kind of look people give someone who just interrupted their fun. "There's space near the end," she muttered. My father didn't say anything. He didn't even glance my way. He was busy adjusting the sleeves of his shirt, the same nervous gesture he always made when he didn't want to get involved. I set my pie down, pulled out the empty chair at the end of the table, and tried not to let it show that my stomach had tightened. A few relatives smiled at me out of politeness, but their eyes slid away too quickly. They'd sensed something off already, and no one wanted to get caught in the middle of whatever this was. We started eating. Small talk drifted around the table, the kind where people pretend everything is fine so they don't have to acknowledge the tension sitting in the room with them. I kept to myself and tried to focus on the turkey, hoping the night would pass quietly. But quiet never lasts long in that house. When it was time for the toast, Laverne tapped her glass with a spoon. The room hushed. She lifted her wine and said a few words about gratitude, family, and the blessings of stability. Then she tilted her head toward me and added, "And of course, some people here will never own a home. Renting forever must be painful." The room went still. A few guests blinked, unsure if they'd heard her right, but her smile told me she meant every word. My father stared at his plate like it had suddenly become the most interesting thing in the world. The air in my lungs thinned, and for a moment it felt like the whole room had tilted. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My voice was somewhere behind the wave of cold that moved through my chest. I reached for a roll, mostly to steady myself. That's when Marla leaned forward with the soup ladle. It tipped. A wave of hot broth splashed across my lap, seeping into my dress, burning as it soaked through. "Oh, shoot," she said, her mouth twisting into a smile she didn't bother hiding. "Maybe renters shouldn't sit so close." I froze. My hands hovered over the table as if the smallest motion would crack the moment wide open. Steam rose from my dress. One relative pretended to check his phone so he wouldn't have to acknowledge what just happened. Another took a sip of wine like she had no idea anyone was suffering 3 feet away. I pressed a napkin against my skin, forcing my voice steady. "I'm fine," I whispered. It wasn't true, but admitting anything would have given them exactly what they wanted. I swallowed the sting, both from the soup and the humiliation, and kept my face still. Dad murmured, "Marla didn't mean it," without lifting his gaze. That hurt more than the soup. That was the story of my life at that table. No one ever meant anything. Not when it came to me. I excused myself, walked down the hallway, and locked the bathroom door behind me. The mirror showed a woman trying too hard to hold herself together. I used the hand dryer to warm the fabric and dabbed at my skin. The noise of the dryer felt like the only place where I could breathe without someone judging me. When I walked back to the dining room, I carried a calmness I didn't entirely feel. I sat down, straightened my dress, and lifted my fork like nothing had happened. Let them think I didn't break. Let them think that soup and a few cheap insults were enough to silence me forever. Dinner continued around me, filled with laughter that didn't include me. I stayed quiet, but something inside me shifted, a small, sharp question rising like a warning. I picked up my fork and nudged the sweet potatoes on my plate, pretending to be engrossed in them. The laughter around me had returned to full volume, but it rang in my ears like a television turned up just a bit too loud, sharp, artificial, relentless. The heat from the soup on my lap had faded, replaced by a slow-burning shame that sat like a rock in my stomach. Marla leaned back in her chair with that same smug posture she'd perfected since we were teenagers. "So," she said, her voice bright, "I've been thinking about a second property. Maybe something up near Broken Bow? A weekend spot. I've been saving smart." One of the aunts down the table practically clapped. "That's wonderful, Marla. You always had such good instincts with money." Another chimed in. "A second home. At your age. That's impressive. What's your secret?" I chewed slower, trying not to look up. It wasn't casual conversation. They were performing. Every compliment was a carefully placed jab, every chuckle a reminder of the role I was expected to play, the one who'd failed, quiet, tired, disposable. Marla tapped her wine glass and turned toward Laverne. "Mom, didn't I say we shouldn't rely on Rowena for anything big? I mean, she lives paycheck to paycheck." Her voice cut through the room like a wine glass dropped on tile. I blinked once, twice, but the air didn't return to my lungs. My hand froze halfway to my water glass. The room tilted. The thing is, it wasn't true. For 3 years, I'd been paying them $8,200 a month. Laverne had offered me the guest house after my divorce, called it a fresh start, a family helping family. I was too raw back then to see the hook. The rent started low. Then came talk of rising property taxes, repairs, insurance. I didn't ask questions. I just paid. I figured peace with my father's wife came with a price tag, but to hear it said like a fact, like gospel, like they were the saviors keeping me afloat, I couldn't believe how easily the lie spread across that table. My father stirred. Someone down the line turned to him, maybe hoping he'd correct it. He didn't. "She manages," he said softly. Somehow. As if I survived by luck. As if nothing I'd done, the long hours, the saving, the swallowing of pride, had ever counted. My chest tightened. The soup was a sting, but this was a cut from someone who was supposed to protect me. Laverne let out a snort that wasn't even masked as polite anymore. "She's meant to rent forever," she said, loud enough to echo. "Some people just aren't built for ownership. You know what I mean." I don't know who gasped. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was the woman across the table who dropped her fork with a soft clink. But I felt it. The moment the room shifted, when everyone knew they'd gone too far, but no one had the guts to stop it. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just reached for my water, took a long, deliberate sip, and let my eyes sweep the table. A cousin looked away. My aunt scratched an invisible itch on her arm. Marla's friend smirked. No one said a word. That told me everything I needed to know about where everyone stood. There were alliances here, unspoken ones, some out of fear, others out of convenience. But no one was on my side, not even Dad. I set my glass down with care, like too much noise would snap the last thread holding my dignity together. I smiled, not wide, not real, but just enough to disarm. If they were waiting for a scene, they wouldn't get it. I knew what they wanted, an outburst, tears, an excuse to label me unstable. I wouldn't hand it to them. But inside, something shifted, something real. This wasn't random. This was designed. Every word, every look, every setup since I walked through that front door had been building toward this performance. And the part that hit me hardest? They thought I'd never push back. They thought their narrative was safe. A flicker of thought crept in, quiet but sharp. What if I stopped paying? What if I just stopped? Laverne laughed again at something Marla said. They were congratulating themselves now, riding high on their little victory. But humiliation has a strange way of clarifying things. Sometimes it burns so deep, it cuts off the dead weight and leaves you with just enough clarity to walk away cleaner than you came in. I didn't know what I'd do next, not yet. But something had broken. Not me, never me. Just the part of me that used to tolerate this. As the laughter swelled around me, a single memory rose in my mind, one that changed everything. It didn't rush in, it crept, slow and sharp, like the chill you only notice when the fire's been out for hours. 3 years earlier, the night had come on heavy, the kind where even the street lamps felt dim. I was in my small apartment in Garland, half-unpacked boxes from the divorce still scattered near the walls. I'd just heated up some leftover Thai and sat down with a glass of wine when I heard the knock. It wasn't a neighbor. No one visited me then. I opened the door to see Laverne, standing with her coat pulled tight and eyes red. Not puffy, not wet, just red like they'd been rubbed raw. She didn't say hello. She looked over her shoulder like someone had followed her, then whispered, "Can we talk? Somewhere private?" I should have hesitated. I didn't. We sat on my thrifted couch and she didn't waste time. "The house," she said, fingers twitching in her lap. "It's bleeding us dry. Taxes, insurance, repairs. It's just too much." I remember blinking, unsure if this was a warning or a pitch. Then she looked at me, her tone softening. "I know things haven't been easy for you since the split, but we were thinking, Carl and I, we have the guest house. It's small but clean, private. You wouldn't be alone. We could charge you a fair rent, lower than market. Just for a little while, help each other out." I didn't answer right away. The idea of living on their property after all those years apart felt fragile. But I'd just signed my half of the divorce papers 2 weeks prior. My apartment lease was month to month. I was exhausted, mentally, financially, emotionally. A fresh start next to family sounded like safety. Laverne reached into her purse and pulled out a tissue. "I don't want to lose this home, Rowena. You're the only one we can count on." I nodded, barely hearing my own voice when I said, "Okay." The move happened fast. I packed everything over one weekend, drove my car back and forth across town 5 times, and parked behind the tall hedge by the backyard. The guest house looked exactly like I remembered from childhood: white siding, green shutters, slanted roof, but smaller, lonelier. Marla watched from the back steps, arms folded like a gatekeeper. No wave, no hello, just observation. Dad appeared briefly, offered to help carry boxes, but Laverne called him in, saying he needed to check the turkey. I didn't see him again until nightfall. By the time I unpacked my last tote and plugged in the lamp beside my bed, I felt something between accomplishment and dread. It wasn't just a place, it was a return, and I wasn't sure I liked that. The first month's rent was modest. Laverne left a printed invoice in my mailbox, signed in cursive with a little smiley face at the end. That should have been my first red flag. By the third month, she claimed new plumbing, issues, and added $100. By the sixth, something about rising property taxes. I paid, quietly, always on time. Better than being homeless, Marla once muttered on her way to her car. I wasn't supposed to hear it, but her voice carried. I bit my tongue and pretended the engine noise drowned her out. But the moment that really stayed with me, the one that dug its roots deep, came late one night. I had stepped out to toss some trash. Laverne was on the phone near the front gate, her voice low but clipped. "She's lucky we let her stay there at all," she said. "Girl can't even afford a real place, but she thinks she's independent." I stopped, hidden by the hedge. A pause. "No, she hasn't caught on. She's still handing over the checks like clockwork. That's $8,000, easy. I mean, come on." I don't remember walking back to the guest house. Just the weight. Like a bag of rocks had been dropped into my chest and left there. They didn't see me as family. I was a revenue stream, a quiet tenant, a way to prop up their lifestyle while dressing it up as generosity. And I'd bought it. Now, back at the Thanksgiving table, I saw it all differently. The smirks, the jabs, the performative praise of Marla, they weren't random cruelty. They were rehearsed cues in a long-running play, with me cast as the failure who'd never quite measure up. Because as long as I stayed quiet, they stayed in control. I reached for my glass again, but didn't drink. I watched Laverne throw her head back, laughing. Marla smirking like she'd just nailed a punchline. My mind drifted back to the first time I handed Laverne a check for over $8,000. She smiled, eyes glinting, called me a blessing. Back then, I mistook it for gratitude. Now I recognized it for what it was: power. It wasn't about money, it was about ownership. Of me, of the narrative, of the space I was allowed to take up. And I had let it happen. The betrayal hadn't started tonight. It started the night I opened that door and believed her. That realization settled in my chest like a stone, and I knew I needed to revisit every warning sign I'd ignored. And there were many, but one day stood out more than most, the day I almost left for good. It was late summer, 2 years back. The kind of afternoon where the heat baked into the pavement and stayed long after the sun dipped behind the trees. I remember getting out of my car, shoulders aching from a long shift, heels in one hand, tote bag heavy in the other. I wanted nothing more than a cool shower and maybe 5 minutes to sit down without someone needing something from me. But as I walked up the path toward the guest house, I noticed something was off. The side door was cracked open. I hadn't left it that way. When I stepped inside, I froze. Laverne and Marla were in my kitchen, rifling through the pantry, checking the fridge, opening drawers like they were cataloging items in a rental unit after a tenant skipped town. Laverne didn't even look up. "We're inspecting," she said, her tone brisk. "Just checking on things." Marla, leaning against the sink with her arms crossed, added with a shrug, "Mom thinks you're running up the utility bills. Just trying to be proactive." I just stood there for a second, trying to process what I was seeing. The invasion of it. The audacity. This wasn't a shared home. It was my space, my refuge. But they didn't care. Without missing a beat, Laverne pulled a folded sheet of paper from her purse and held it out to me. "This is just an update," she said, like she was offering a menu at a restaurant. It was a notice, rent increasing again, maintenance fees now tacked on monthly, a cap on water usage. "We have to adjust," she said lightly. "It's the economy, and frankly, you should be grateful. Family rates are always cheaper." I stared at the paper, blinking. I was already paying more than my friends in newer apartments. And I lived in a converted shed with a leaky sink and no central air. They acted like they were doing me a favor. That night, after they left, I sat on the edge of my bed with my hands balled into fists. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just felt hollow, like something in me had been scooped out and replaced with dread. I pulled my old suitcase from the closet and started packing. A few clothes, some paperwork, a photo of my mother. I didn't have much, but I needed out. I called 3 places I'd bookmarked months earlier. One didn't answer. The second wanted 2 months' rent up front. The third said their last unit had just been leased. I sat at the tiny kitchen table, stared at my coffee mug, and told myself I'd stick it out. Just a little longer, save more, plan better. But deep down, I already knew that decision would cost me something I hadn't fully named yet: dignity. Later that evening, just as the cicadas began their chorus, there was a knock. Carlin. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, eyes low. "Laverne said you looked upset earlier," he murmured. "Is everything okay?" I handed him the notice. Let him read it. His eyes moved too fast over the words, like he already knew what it said. "She handles all this," he said, offering the paper back. "She means well. It's just hard times." He didn't ask what I thought, didn't offer help, just stood there like a man trying not to take sides in his own family. I could have said something, pushed back, but I didn't. I knew where that would lead. Him retreating, Laverne fuming, and me painted as the problem. So I said, "Thanks, Dad. I'm fine." And he nodded, relieved I hadn't made it harder for him. Hours later, I was brushing my teeth when I heard voices through the open guesthouse window. The house sat just 30 feet away, and when they spoke in the kitchen, the sound carried clear. "She's not going anywhere," Laverne said, her voice amused. "She can't afford to." Marla laughed. "I told you." I set my toothbrush down and stared at my reflection. They weren't guessing, they were counting on it. And the worst part was, they were right. I hadn't stayed because I was comfortable. I stayed because they'd boxed me in so slowly, I hadn't realized I'd stopped reaching for the exit. That night, I unpacked my suitcase, hung my clothes back up, told myself I'd make it work. But now, sitting at this same table, watching Laverne chuckle over some joke no one found funny, I could finally see it for what it was: endurance, dressed as patience. They'd trained me to stay small. Every rent hike, every sneer, every moment I felt like I was overreacting. It was all part of a slow erosion. The walls hadn't closed in. They'd been moved inch by inch while I convinced myself it was temporary. I looked at the faces around the table. No one was questioning her. No one said, "That's enough." No one looked shocked anymore. And something deep inside me stirred, slow but strong. A boundary, not loud, not complete, but real. For the first time in years, I didn't just want to leave. I wanted them to see me walk away. That memory surfaced like something pulled from the bottom of a lake, sodden, cold, and heavy in my chest. It wasn't the loudest moment, not the most dramatic, but it was the day everything quietly, irrevocably shifted. It was midsummer, just over a year before the Thanksgiving that would shatter whatever was left of my self-respect. I'd worked a double shift that day and pulled into the driveway around 6:30 p.m., the sun still blazing low across the horizon. I remember feeling a kind of exhausted calm, One of those rare evenings where I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd get to sit still. Until I saw the contractor's van parked beside the guest house. At first, I thought maybe he was fixing the plumbing. There'd been a slow drip under the kitchen sink I hadn't mentioned, trying to avoid the inevitable, "You're lucky we let you live here" speech from Laverne. But when I stepped through the door, that hope evaporated. My living room was half disassembled. The coffee table had been moved, couch cushions propped against the wall. Cabinet doors hung open, some with sticky notes marking them. My books had been pulled from the shelf and stacked in piles. And in the middle of it, all stood Laverne, clipboard in hand, talking to a man I didn't recognize. "Oh, you're back," she said, not a hint of apology in her tone. "We're just finalizing the upgrades." "Upgrades?" I asked, though I could barely get the word out. Laverne turned to the contractor. "You can start removing the trim tomorrow. The insulation's a mess." Then, to me, "Don't worry, it'll be better when it's finished." I looked at the man. He gave me a half smile, awkward, clearly caught in something he hadn't signed up for. Then he quietly gathered his tools and stepped outside. Laverne handed me a crisp sheet of paper from her clipboard. "This outlines the improvements," she said casually. "And the new rate, starting next month." The invoice listed over $5,000 in structural and efficiency enhancements. I stared at the number, unable to breathe. "This place isn't free to maintain," she added. "I've done my best to keep it affordable for you. But if we don't raise your rent to cover the costs, it's just not sustainable." I'd already endured 2 major increases that year. This would push it past what most people in Plano were paying for full houses with 2-car garages. And here I was, in a guest house that didn't even have a real bedroom door. Before I could respond, Marla stepped inside, holding a soda can and grinning like she'd walked into a sitcom. "You should be grateful Mom keeps this place standing," she said. "If it were up to Dad, he'd bulldoze the whole thing." She laughed. Laverne didn't disagree. Neither looked at me like I lived there, only like I was someone who owed them. The contractor's footsteps crunched gravel outside. I didn't move. I didn't argue. I took the paper and left. It folded on the kitchen counter, not wanting to crumple it, because somehow that would have felt like giving in. That night, I walked up to the main house and found my father sitting in his recliner, watching a rerun of a game show he'd probably seen 5 times already. I stood by the door, paper in hand, waiting for him to look at me. "Hey, baby," he said. "You hungry?" "No," I said. "Can we talk?" He muted the TV and gave me his full attention for about 10 seconds. "I can't afford this rent," I told him gently. "It's more than most people pay for full homes. She keeps raising it." He sighed and rubbed his temples. "Your stepmother just wants to keep things stable. You know how much the repairs cost around here." I held out the invoice. "Can you look at this?" He didn't take it. Instead, he leaned back, eyes suddenly tired. "I don't get involved in women's matters." That was the sentence. That exact phrase. Not, "I don't want to take sides." Not, "Let's figure this out." No. Women's matters. It stung more than I expected, and I expected plenty. I didn't say another word, just walked back down the gravel path, the crunch under my feet louder than it should have been in the still night air. I paused by the guest house door, and, just before turning the knob, I heard them, Laverne and Marla, through the open window. "She won't say no," Laverne said flatly. "She never has." Marla laughed again. "Some people are just meant to stay small." That sentence settled over me like a second skin. Meant to stay small. I opened the door, closed it behind me, and leaned against it, too stunned to cry. But eventually, I did. I cried into the palms of my hands until they were wet and shaking, until I couldn't feel the tears anymore. And I hated everything in that moment. Not just them, not just the way they had chipped away at me over the years. I hated myself for letting it happen, for confusing survival with strength, for mistaking silence for resilience, for becoming someone who asked permission just to breathe. I sat there a long time before standing up again. I turned on the light, walked to the kitchen, pulled my laptop from the drawer, and opened apartment listings. I even made a list, places with move-in dates within 30 days, prices under $2,000. But nothing added up. Deposits, application fees, moving costs, and I still had a lease here, even if no one admitted it existed. After 2 hours, I closed the laptop. It felt like surrender. That was the night I shrank for the last time. I didn't know it then, but I do now. That night wasn't about housing or money or rent. It was about identity, about who I'd become in their eyes. A tenant, a burden, a joke, not a daughter, not family, not a person who mattered. And I carried that quiet breaking with me for a long, long time. I thought I had reached my limit, but the worst was still ahead of me. And on a sticky evening 6 months before that Thanksgiving dinner, I found out just how far they were willing to go. The sun had already dipped behind the trees, but the heat lingered like it didn't want to leave. Cicadas screamed from the branches. I sat on the tiny porch of the guest house, a glass of lukewarm tea in my hand, trying to shake off the day. I'd just finished back-to-back shifts and was too tired to cook, too restless to sleep. That porch was never comfortable, but on nights like that, it felt like the only place I could breathe. Until I heard voices behind the fence. Laverne's voice was low and clipped. Marla's was sharper, louder, like she wanted to be heard. I leaned slightly, not trying to eavesdrop, but unable to tune them out. "She's been here too long," Marla said. "This was supposed to be temporary." Laverne muttered something I couldn't make out. Then, clear as day, "We should just evict her, or double the rent again. She'll pay. She always pays." It was like someone poured ice water down my spine. Laverne answered, flat and certain. "She doesn't have the courage to leave. That's why we can push." I didn't breathe. My fingers dug into the wooden armrest of the porch chair. Were they serious? After all I'd paid? After everything I'd given up just to keep the peace? And they were still talking. "We'll say market rates have changed," Laverne continued. $3,000 more a month. That should squeeze her." Marla laughed like it was a joke worth toasting. "Good. She'll panic and do whatever we say." I gripped the railing so tight, I thought it might splinter under my hands. Then, footsteps. 2 neighbors, an older couple, walked past the side fence with their golden retriever. They caught just enough of the conversation to glance toward me with something that looked like pity. That broke something in me. It wasn't just that my privacy had been invaded. It wasn't just that I was being manipulated financially. It was that I was being discussed like I wasn't a person at all, just a problem, a pawn. And now the neighbors knew it too. I stared straight ahead, eyes wide, jaw locked. My cheeks burned. Not from the heat, but from the humiliation crawling under my skin. Then I heard Laverne's voice again, dismissive and final. "She's a permanent renter. That's her role." That sentence sliced straight through me. That was the moment it all crystallized. Not just what they thought of me, but what I had allowed them to turn me into. I didn't even feel sadness anymore. Just a low, tight pull in my chest. A clean snap of something invisible. The way a branch breaks before anyone notices it's dead. I stood. I didn't slam the screen door. I didn't make a scene. I just walked, steady and silent, toward the main house. I stepped into the kitchen, empty. The lights were still on. Dirty. Dishes stacked in the sink. A half-empty bottle of wine on the counter. Someone had left the oven light on, probably from reheating leftovers. The air still carried the scent of fried turkey and buttered rolls from earlier in the week. But no one was there. I looked around that kitchen, once familiar, now foreign. It wasn't a home anymore, it was a web. I could hear my heartbeat, fast, angry, then fearful. I wanted to scream, to yell so loud the walls shook, but instead, I stood still. Because what if they really followed through? What if they actually evicted me? I had no lease, no written protections. If they raised the rent again or claimed I was violating some made-up rule, what could I do? That fear. That's what they counted on. I turned around and walked back to the guest house, shutting the door gently behind me. No drama, no raised voice, just the sound of metal clicking into place behind me. I sat at my tiny kitchen table, the same one I ate alone at most nights, and pulled out an old spiral notebook from the drawer. I flipped past grocery lists, to-do reminders, and birthday notes until I found a blank page. Then I started writing every rent payment, every increase. I wrote the date, the amount, the excuse Laverne had given. Repairs. Insurance changes. Inflation. One by one, year by year, line after line. When I finished, I flipped back through the pages and added up the numbers. I had to do it twice because I didn't believe it the first time. In just under 3 years, I had paid them nearly $290,000. I looked around the guest house. There were water stains on the ceiling that had never been fixed. The faucet still wobbled. The front door didn't lock right unless you jiggled it. That money could have bought a home, twice. I turned to a fresh page and wrote just one sentence at the top. This ends soon. And as the words settled into the paper, I felt something shift inside me. Not rage, not even revenge, just resolve. I didn't know it then, but the moment I picked up my pen, the balance of power began to shift. Not in fireworks, not in some grand gesture, just a quiet, private change in me. The kind of change you don't notice until it's already rewriting who you are. It was 3 months before Thanksgiving, a Sunday morning. I'd gone to the store early, hoping to beat the weekend rush. Eggs, milk, coffee, the usual staples. I'd even picked up a fresh loaf of sourdough from the bakery aisle. Simple comforts. I remember the sun was gentle that day, the kind that tricks you into thinking peace is possible. But when I turned into the driveway, something didn't feel right. There were cars parked everywhere, lined along the curb, stacked in front of the garage, relatives' cars. Some I hadn't seen in over a year. My cousins from Denton, Aunt Roberta's old Cadillac with the dented bumper. No one had told me there would be a gathering. As I stepped out of the car with the groceries in my arms, a tightness gathered in my stomach. That same feeling I used to get as a child before parent-teacher conferences or dentist appointments. I paused for a second, considering going straight to the guest house. But something in me, curiosity, maybe, or instinct, told me to walk toward the main house. The front door creaked as I pushed it open. They were all in the living room. It was too quiet. That kind of sudden silence you feel more than hear. Laverne sat in the center like she was hosting court. Marla stood just behind her, arms folded tight, mouth pulled into a knowing smirk. Carlin sat to the side, avoiding my eyes. Aunt Roberta was there, dressed neatly in Sunday beige, pearls at her neck. My cousins sat stiff, pretending not to look directly at me. I took one step inside and felt the weight of it. Laverne cleared her throat. "We held a vote," she said, no warmth in her voice. "The family believes you've become financially irresponsible." I blinked. "Excuse me?" Roberta chimed in, soft but stern. "Honey, you can't keep depending on your stepfamily forever. It's not fair to them." The room tilted slightly. I nearly laughed. Me? Dependent? I'd been paying through the nose just to live in their backyard. Paying for groceries they ate, for repairs they never made, for heat I barely used. "You're serious?" I said quietly. Laverne lifted a manila folder from the table and began pulling out sheets. Printed utility bills, account summaries, what looked like past due notices. "These," she said, "are just a sample of what you've neglected." I stepped closer. The numbers were wrong. Dates didn't line up. Some of the documents looked like they'd been edited or copied over. Bold red letters across the top screamed "overdue," but the details were sloppy. It was all manufactured. Marla didn't wait. "I've been telling them for months," she said. "She's slipping, pretending to be the victim while mooching. Off our kindness." The walls didn't move, but it felt like they closed in. I felt the stares, the judgment, the pile-on. My hands began to shake, not from fear, but from anger I didn't yet know how to show. I turned to my father. He wouldn't meet my eyes. His hands were folded tight in his lap. He looked small, like a boy in trouble. "Dad?" I asked. Nothing. The silence broke something in me. Laverne, sensing the moment, leaned forward. "We've decided to increase your rent again. Starting next month, another $4,000. Aunt Roberta nodded, her voice full of false concern. "It's for your own good, sweetheart. Helps you learn responsibility." I stopped breathing for a second, not because I was shocked, but because I finally understood. They weren't just trying to squeeze money out of me. They were trying to rewrite the story, paint me as unstable, ungrateful, and unreliable. And worse, everyone in the room was willing to play along. I stepped forward, calm but sharp. "Show me the originals," I said. Laverne narrowed her eyes. "What?" "The original bills, the real documents, not these edited copies." She scoffed. "That's none of your concern." I tilted my head slightly and gave a smile. Not kind, not polite, but knowing. "Then we're done here," I said. Marla shifted, the smirk fading just a touch. I picked up the grocery bags I had set by the door. One of the paper handles tore a little from the weight, but I didn't flinch. I stood straighter than I had in months. I looked around the room, not at relatives, but at obstacles. Barriers I had allowed to define me. No more. Without another word, I turned toward the door. Behind me, Laverne called out, "If you walk away now, you lose your place here." I didn't stop. I didn't answer. My silence said everything I needed it to. I didn't realize until I stepped outside that Laverne had underestimated the one thing she thought she controlled, me. Monday morning came, gray and still. I was early, like always. Downtown Dallas was just beginning to stir. Traffic low, sidewalks damp from a light overnight drizzle. I parked, grabbed my work tote, and made my way up to the office tower like I'd done for years. But when I held my badge to the scanner, nothing happened. I tried again, still red. "Access denied," the security guard said, peering over his monitor. "You'll need to check in with HR. They flagged your account." Something twisted low in my gut. I hadn't done anything wrong, but that didn't seem to matter much anymore. My instincts whispered what I didn't want to hear. Laverne had made her move. The elevator ride to the 8th floor felt longer than usual. Each ding of passing levels echoed in my ears like a countdown. Mr. Alden, our HR manager, sat behind a tidy desk, lips pursed, eyes heavy with discomfort. A manila folder sat between us, thicker than it should have been for a standard Monday meeting. "Rowena," he began, voice clipped, "we received an anonymous complaint." "Of course you did. Fraud, rent delinquency, misuse of company funds," he read. I stared at him, then at the file. "It's a mistake," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Those claims aren't true." He nodded, but his fingers tapped nervously against the desk. "The complaint includes documentation, bank screenshots, PDFs. They raise serious questions." He slid one page across to me. I recognized it immediately. A distorted version of my bank statement, with lines highlighted and bolded to suggest I had rerouted company reimbursements into personal accounts. But the formatting was messy, the annotations sloppy, the phrasing too familiar. Phrases like inappropriate timing and unexplained gaps were straight out of Laverne's vocabulary. The way irresponsible was spelled incorrectly 3 different times. Pure Marla. "They're fake," I said. Mr. Alden leaned back, folding his hands. "Until we complete our internal review, we're placing you on leave, effective immediately." He didn't meet my eyes when he said it. I gathered my things slowly. When I walked back through the office, coworkers stopped what they were doing. Some glanced away, others stared too long. Nobody spoke. The door clicked behind me, and I was alone on the sidewalk. It felt like the world had stopped noticing me altogether. That night, I sat at my kitchen table in silence. The groceries from yesterday were still in bags by the fridge. A week's worth of unopened mail had started to pile up on the counter. And me? I just sat there, too tired to cry, too stunned to scream. Every act they'd done, Laverne, Marla, even Carlin's silence, started to replay, one after the other. The wine glass judgments, the gaslighting, the day they laughed about raising, my rent to scare me, the faked family vote. Now this. They didn't want me just gone, they wanted me erased, and I was halfway there. My phone buzzed. A text from Kelly, a coworker in finance. "Something's weird. The PDFs HR got. The metadata looks edited, and if you want help, I'll look." Another message came a moment later, from Sam, a shy intern I once stood up for during a team presentation. "They picked you because they thought you wouldn't fight back." I read those 2 lines over and over. They thought you wouldn't fight back. My breath steadied. I got up, turned on my laptop, and opened my bank archive. I didn't know what I was searching for exactly, just that I had to look. And then I saw it. A line item in a rent payment from months back. The transaction read, "Rent received from Rowena D." The timestamp was clear. The name was spelled correctly. It was embedded in the original file, before any corrections Marla could have made. They'd missed one. It was sloppy. It was proof. I opened a new folder and labeled it in all caps, "Truth." That night, I stayed up organizing everything. Original statements, emails, transaction receipts, screenshots. I printed hard copies, highlighted matching dates, circled discrepancies in Laverne's edits. Then I downloaded the metadata logs from the tampered PDFs. Kelly had been right. They were traced back to a public laptop in Carlin's study. By the time I finished, the sun was just peeking over the rooftops. Later that afternoon, I drove back to the house. I didn't text. I didn't call. I just parked, walked up the front path, and let myself in. The smell of lavender candles and cheap wine hit me first. The living room was warm with evening light. Laverne was laughing with 2 of her bridge friends, both of whom paused at my entrance. Marla sat cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through her phone, unbothered. Carlin came from the kitchen, drying his hands with a dish towel. He stopped in the doorway when he saw me. I said nothing. I placed the folder on the coffee table. "I'm done playing along," I said evenly. Laverne didn't even look up at first. "You weren't invited." I opened the folder. One by one, I laid out the papers. The original bank receipts, the doctored versions, the HR complaint metadata, with Marla's email account tied to the file download. All of it. The room changed. Marla's face went white. Her phone slipped from her hand and landed on the rug. Laverne's smile dropped like a curtain. Carlin moved toward the armchair and sat slowly, his expression crumbling. "You tried to erase me," I said. "Now you'll get to explain this. To HR, to the police, to anyone else who needs to see it." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. They had counted on my silence, my fear, my habit of enduring. But I had evidence now. And more than that, I had nothing left to lose. I turned and walked toward the door. No one stopped me this time. I thought exposing the truth would break them, but I didn't expect what came next. The voicemail came just before sunrise. The sky outside my window was still ink dark, with only the faintest blue creeping in at the edges. I hadn't slept much. My body was exhausted, but my mind felt sharper than it had in years. Carlin's voice trembled through the speaker. "Rowena, please call me back. Everything's falling apart." I didn't call. Instead, I pulled the curtains aside and watched as dawn rolled in over Plano. For the first time in a long time, I felt no urgency, no panic, just steadiness. By mid-morning, I heard the low rumble of engines out front. I stepped out quietly, coffee in hand, and saw 2 patrol cars parked in front of the main house. Neighbors stood along the sidewalk, arms crossed, phones in hand, whispering low. Even Mrs. Cole from 2 doors down, who normally kept to herself, had a look of concern as she leaned on her fence post. Laverne stood on the porch in her bathrobe, her voice raised, arguing with a police officer who wasn't having it. "That's private family business," she snapped. The officer calmly replied, "Ma'am, bank fraud is not a private matter." Marla was on the porch steps, knees tucked under her chin, tears streaming down her face, loud, dramatic sobs that didn't quite reach her eyes. The kind of crying you do when you know you're being watched. I didn't go over. I stayed on the sidewalk, far enough to stay out of the way, close enough to witness. A silver sedan pulled up. A sharply dressed man stepped out, black briefcase in hand, crisp navy suit. He introduced himself to the officers as a representative from my bank. He confirmed everything. "Rowena Davis has made consistent full rent payments for 3 years, he said clearly. And we've confirmed an attempt to falsify multiple transaction records linked to her account." Laverne tried to interject, waving her hands, but the officer raised his palm. "Ma'am, I need you to remain silent while the investigation continues." Then they turned to Marla. "Please unlock your laptop." Her crying stopped. Her hands shook as she clutched the device closer to her chest, eyes darting around for someone, anyone, to rescue her. No one did. I stood still, watching it unfold, not with glee, but with something closer to solemn relief. Justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Later, Carlin walked down the driveway toward me. He looked older somehow, shoulders slumped, eyes heavy. "I didn't know they went this far," he murmured, stopping a few feet away. "You knew enough," I said. "You knew they were lying. You just didn't stop it." He opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it. His hands dropped to his sides. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "but some things don't go backward." I nodded, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement. There was nothing left to fight for between us. By lunchtime, my phone rang again. It was Mr. Alden from HR. "Ms. Davis," he began, his tone more formal than usual, "I want to offer a personal apology. The complaint has been reviewed and dismissed. Your position is reinstated. We found evidence that the documents were tampered with from a device not registered in our system. We're very sorry." I thanked him. I meant it. There was no joy in being right, but there was peace in not being wronged anymore. That afternoon, I returned to the guest house for the last time. I moved slowly, folding clothes, gathering papers, taping boxes. At the bottom of the drawer in the hallway, behind a pile of dish rags, I found it, the pumpkin-patterned kitchen towel. I hadn't seen it since that Thanksgiving, the one where I tried so hard to belong. I had bought it thinking it would add a cozy touch. It ended up stained with spilled gravy and indifference. But now, I held it differently, not like a reminder of humiliation, but a badge of survival. I folded it carefully and placed it on top of my new home box. It was coming with me. Before I left, I made one last call. I need to cancel all recurring transfers to Laverne and Marla Marlowe, I told the bank clerk, effective immediately. He read back the names. Confirmed! As I hung up, I felt it. An actual shift in my body, like something heavy finally slid off my chest and hit the floor. The next morning, I signed the final papers. My new place was a quiet townhouse tucked between two retired couples, just a few blocks from the library. It wasn't big, it wasn't flashy, but the sun came through the windows like it meant something. I set the pumpkin towel on the counter. It looked right there, like it had been waiting to serve a new purpose. 3 days later, Laverne showed up. I heard the knock and looked through the peephole. She stood there with a forced smile, hair done up, earrings jangling. "We should talk, privately," she said. I opened the door just enough. "No," I said, "not anymore." She started to respond, to explain something, but I didn't wait. I closed the door, slow, steady, final. The lock clicked softly behind her. Now, as Thanksgiving approaches, I'm not preparing a table for people who never saw me. I'm not baking for approval. I'm simply living. The family I fought to keep never really existed, not for me. They were roles written before I arrived, and I spent too long auditioning for a part that was never mine. But I breathe easier now. I'm not fully healed. I still double-check locks. I still flinch when my phone rings sometimes, but I'm not hiding anymore. I'm not apologizing for simply existing. This home, this quiet, imperfect, sunlit space, is mine. And in the end, I didn't win them back. But I won myself, and that was the only victory that ever mattered.